Marcus, Jonathan, Kelly, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, we've all been watching the big fires in California. We've all got smoky skies. I'm curious, can we start with you, Marcus? Can you talk a little bit about what life is like for a wildland firefighter?
Sure. I would say, first of all, it's a very sort of satisfying and fulfilling career because a lot of people that do it like to be outside, like to help their neighbors. It's a public service that I think a lot of us feel satisfied at doing at the end of the day. But really the realities that we're starting to face now with potential climate change, I would say, increased fire seasons, more complex, longer duration, we're really starting to see, I would say, firefighters in a crisis mode. And this crisis mode is due to attrition. We have less firefighters on the ground at our federal levels because the pay and benefits are not adequate. Folks are asked to basically have these year-round fire seasons where we're committed to go help across the country. So I would say we're really kind of approaching a train wreck and a serious issue where firefighters are tired, they're kind of challenged mentally and physically, and it's really starting to enter a crisis mode, I would say.
So recently I saw an ad for wildland firefighters that said the job's paid $15 an hour. And I understand that's a little bit of a bump, a Biden era bump. But one, is that enough to live on? And two, my understanding is these are considered seasonal jobs.
So that $15 an hour is roughly for our entry-level jobs, which, as you said, just recently bumped up. So before that, it was anywhere from $13 to $14 an hour, depending where you're at in the country. And these are all temporary 1039 positions is what they're considered, which have zero benefits except for medical care. And the medical care they have to pay for, it gets subsidized by the federal government during their employment, but as soon as the winter and they're laid off after 6 months, they have to pay the full price. So no retirement, no opportunity to contribute to any kind of 401k. Basically zero benefits. So when the fire season's over, and this is the bulk of our federal firefighters are really these temporary employees. They're the ones that make up 3/4 of our hot shots. They're the ones that make up 3/4 of our heliTAC and smoke jumpers. As soon as the season's over, they basically have no ability to access mental health care benefits, to reach out for any kind of long-term physical issues they're having. Once they're laid off, and if their fire family's not there to support them, they have no benefits. So it's a tough position we put these temporary employees in, and many of them live in their cars because they can't afford the housing around where they work. So places, in the mountains, these mountain towns that have very expensive places to live that don't have crew quarters, basically these kids are living in their cars to go and fight wildland fire across the country, which is, it's hard to say and hard to think about, but I've been there. I did 11 years as a seasonal, and I look back and just kind of like unbelievable.
Yeah. Kelly Martin, you worked as a wildland firefighter for 35 years for the Forest Service and for the Bureau of Land Management. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this sort of long-term immersion in emergency situations, which is different from what we see sort of municipal firefighters or even police officers. Wildland firefighters are dealing with something very different.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Laura. And just for clarification, I spent half my career with the Forest Service and half with the National Park Service. And didn't work for the BLM, but worked with them quite a bit throughout my career. The immersion that we're seeing now is way completely different than when I started 35 years ago. I might have gained maybe 400 hours of overtime during a summer season. And now we're seeing people regularly working 1,000, 1,500. And I think I've even heard that there's people out there that are almost working like 2,000 hours of overtime a year. So this constant immersion in an emergency mode is really having a tremendous impact on people's mental health and well-being, to say nothing of their physical well-being as well, when they're exposed to tremendous amounts of smoke, lots of risks and dangers with traveling on really rough, rugged backcountry roads. Vehicle accidents are always an issue. falling snags, burnovers. So that idea that individuals are now in this almost 24/7 year after year, we've really started seeing it accelerate in 2000, and now for 2001, it's without a doubt that that's how people are living their lives. Whereas in municipal fire departments, a fire station might get a call, they're 4 minutes en route to the emergency, and they have the emergency stabilized within about an hour and a half. That's simply just not the case for wildland firefighters. We are in it 24/7, week after week, month after month, and now we're talking year after year. So it really is significantly different. The environment that we're asking people to work in is significantly very, very hard on people, physically, mentally, and emotionally, and that's really what we have to address.
Right. So earlier this year, firefighter Tim Hart was killed due to injuries he sustained on a fire here in New Mexico. And after his death, I remember seeing a GoFundMe campaign to help his family dealing with the expenses due to his hospitalization. And I just remember thinking he was a federal employee working on a federal fire. What kinds of how are firefighters taken care of when they sustain injuries or unfortunate accidents like this?
So that's kind of the reality of the situation. There's an organization that was started roughly 20 years ago called the Wildland Firefighter Foundation. And really that organization was the catalyst, and it's all charity donations from basically wildland firefighters supporting each other. So I would say recently, land management agencies have started to do a better job. I would give credit there, but I would say starting to. And we're seeing where they're not being able to cover, these GoFundMe and the Wildland Firefighter Foundation cover Tim's family to be able to travel down, be able to cover mortgage and bills when he's in a tough position in a hospital, any of our firefighters, be able to help the family make it through, because these families that we have basically depend on us being firefighters and us going and working and being away from home for 6 months out of the year. So as soon as that money's gone, there's no base, there's no help for the family. So long-term sort of medical care, I know the Wildland Firefighter Foundation has bought wheelchairs, has helped rehab. And the reality of why we need this is our OWCP program, the Office of Workmen's Comp, is broken. We have firefighters struggling that get injured on the job, struggling year after year to basically just survive these catastrophic incidents they have with mountains of paperwork, very little help from the federal government, and basically it's easier to just get outside donations to make it through.
Wow. Jonathan, you were a wildland firefighter for over a decade. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the private struggles that wildland firefighters are going through that, we in the public just have no idea these things are happening.
Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity to be here. Some of the private struggles that, I went through and I know my friends have gone through are just the isolation that you feel and the separation you have from your friends, from your families back home, the events that you miss out on, birthdays, weddings, graduations. I even know of, husbands and partners that were I was on fire with while their wife delivered, their children. You miss out on these significant moments, and when it comes time to lay down at night and try to get some sleep, you think about these things, and it really begins to weigh on you. What am I missing out on? What am I doing here? I know when I started to have a family with my wife, it just became no longer sustainable for us or realistic for us to potentially move our whole family across the country in order for me to chase a promotional opportunity, to effectively actually have more responsibility and be gone a lot more. And so when that goes on, it becomes a real struggle. And sometimes we're able to successfully bury or suppress those memories. But it comes out in the wintertime. People turn to alcohol or drugs. We've lost partners and friends to suicide from it all, and so it's a real problem within the community that frankly isn't, I think, talked about enough and or addressed as best as it could be.
So I think the public, we very much have this perception of wildland firefighters. When our communities are at risk, people go out there with signs and want to bake cookies and drop off water and are so grateful when y'all arrive. But it really feels to me that there's this disconnect between what we, the public, think you all are going through and what is actually happening. And I'm curious, how are you supported by these federal agencies that we all pay taxes to and are imagining that you're being supported? Is there support for things like depression or PTSD or anxiety or helping address this work-life balance that seems to be a problem?
I would say those are catchwords that different agency leadership have thrown out there, work-life balance. But the reality, Laura, is that these programs are anemic at best. And so I would be remiss to say that there's no help. We do have help networks, but I myself have tried to look into them. Like for me as a first responder to seek help on a particular kind of issue, like there's no counselors in my area that specialize in that are within that program. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people have faced with. It's very difficult to find mental health help on there. It's very difficult to go through the program, and really you only get like 5 to 7 visits and then it's on you. So a very weak support network, and like I was saying with the temporary employees, as soon as they're laid off, they basically have no access to this. So when you're in that transition time, like Johnny's talking about, into the season, you go away from your fire family, now you're turning to alcohol and drugs to hit those voids. You're very angry with the world, I would say. It's really kind of when I see these war movies of people coming back from Vietnam or war and trying to like reintegrate into society, that's really what people go through on a yearly cyclical basis of being totally immersed in a war type setting away from all your support network, and then you come back to try to integrate. And so I would say it's very poor, and I think it's a known issue, and folks are working on it, but at a very slow rate to really make a significant change, I would say. We need more money, we need better programs, we need more support.
So speaking of change, I'd like to talk a little bit about climate change. Let's start with you, Kelly. Fires 35 years ago compared with the fires we're seeing now. How has climate change affected the fire season and the wildland firefighters who have to deal with fire season?
Think about the environment that we're working in now and how different that was when I first started. So climate change is certainly a contributing factor, especially when we look at, significantly higher temperatures, longer fire seasons. So we can actually measure that. So we know that that's actually occurring. The other thing that's occurring is this unnatural fuel buildup. If you can imagine, from one moment, the Western United States was very void of people about 150 years ago. So quote unquote, the good fire or the friendly fire was allowed to play its natural role on the landscape for millennia. And here we come and we occupy the West at tremendous numbers. California used to have 1.5 million people in 1900, and now they're up to 40 million. So we're seeing this play out where not only is climate change adding to these large mega fires, but we're also seeing the unnatural fuel buildup because of the suppression of wildfires on the landscape, which is increasing the fuel loading in the vegetation and also increasing the insect disease and drought susceptibility to trees that are on the landscape and adding to the population explosion. So it's really putting our firefighters in a really untenable situation, especially these last 24 months. This is really should portend to all of us what the years are going to look like in the years to come. And we cannot keep operating under the same antiquated system that we developed 50 years ago. So we're really in need of a transformation of our wildland fire workforce. and what that looks like going forward is should be very different than when I first started. So those are the things that are really contributing to what we're seeing now with these large wildfires.
So speaking of transformation, Jonathan, as part of your volunteer work for grassroots wildland firefighters, you're looking at how some policy changes and legislative fixes could make things better for this workforce. Let's start with Congress. What could Congress be doing? And then maybe what are some of the policy changes that federal agencies might implement?
Yeah, so this year we're seeing actually alignment between both the administration and Congress and really beginning to address the needs of wildland firefighters and everything that's happening out west. We're seeing with the infrastructure package that there is language and provisions in there that will begin to address a salary increase as well as classification for wildland firefighters to no longer be forestry technicians, but actual wildland firefighters. But really, some of the lesser known things that are in there begin with like a foothold, if you will, on beginning to address mental health issues, which we were just talking about recently, and that's in the infrastructure package. This is just a kind of a nice secondary step to the administration's increase with the $15 an hour starting wage. We need to take more steps. Congress should be working with the land management agencies to provide them the funds that they need to help to fund the kind of land management and ecosystem management that begins to address the current reality and the future conditions, much like Kelly was talking about, because that's directly related to our firefighters' working conditions, their health and their well-being. A salary increase is nice, but to have these policy changes and have Congress working hand in hand with the land management agencies to begin to build the 21st century civilian civil service that America deserves is really what needs to be done. There's a lot of steps that need to be taken. Fire suppression is just one chunk of it, but actually setting realistic and land management targets is a whole other part of it as well.
So it sounds like Congress is thinking about some of these issues. I'm curious from each of you what you wish your congressional delegation truly understood about the conditions and the need for this sort of professionalization of this workforce. You want to start, Marcus?
Sure. I think the message for me is that we're headed for a train wreck, Laura. And this is a train wreck of what Kelly was talking about, increasing fire size and complexity. The Cerro Grande fire, when it happened in 2000, was a huge fire for New Mexico. It was the biggest fire in the books. And now that thing's been dwarfed many times over with Los Conchas, Whitewater, Baldy, you name it, and we're just waiting for the next one essentially. So our workload is increasing. We're having a hard time filling jobs in remote duty locations. And part of this is pay and benefits. 10, 15 years ago, we would have 400 or 500 applicants for an entry-level fire job on some of the crews I worked on. Now we're lucky if we see 50. So with those kind of numbers, we're headed to a train wreck where one time there's going to be a town here in New Mexico that's going to call for federal assistance, federal help, and guess what? Nobody's going to show up because that local fire engine's not staffed. The incident management team doesn't have team members on it to actually come and address a huge catastrophic wildfire. So we're headed to a train wreck. And really, we need to work on how we start piecing that together like Johnny was talking about. We really need to ask the question, what do we want this wildland fire service to look like in 10, 20, 30 years when we know there's not a question of a doubt that this is going to continue on and it's unsustainable. So how are we going to address classifying them as wildland firefighters? How are we going to get them the right mental and physical help to be healthy, really tactical athletes, which is what they are throughout the summer season. And for me, a big part of this, honestly, is maybe trying to think outside the box, because as Kelly mentioned, this box was built 50, 60 years ago in a very different environment. I'd say both environmentally, politically, culturally, and that box is not sustainable. So maybe it's a national fire service where we get rid of some of these redundancies, we make a more efficient system, we kind of like take some of the politics out of it, hopefully, and really give the American taxpayer what they deserve, an efficient, professional wildland fire service that's going to be there when they call for that emergency. And those are things I'd like to see.
How about you, Kelly?
I really think that there has to be a real recognition by the public and the taxpayers that this current system that we're talking about, again, built 50 years ago, is unsustainable. There is no more capacity in our current system for salaries, for additional people. And so we are going to have to go to the American people and the taxpayers and ask for more money, not just for suppression, but for land management. And it's not just the federal government. We really need to partner with the states. There's a lot of areas out there that are going to need infrastructure development to deal with not just logs on trucks, but also with the excessive fuel buildup and creating a demand for this natural resource that we call biomass, which is a lot of vegetation on the landscape. So developing that locally, I think, is a real key, and having a partnership between state governments and federal governments to address this issue on a long-term basis. Again, 25 to 50 years out, 10 years isn't going to cut it. We really have to think this is a long game, this is long-term, and we need some real novel ideas and visions about what healthy landscapes look like. Because right now, we are losing so much carbon stock on the landscape to these large fires. And people need to know we cannot keep suppressing fires in perpetuity. We have to be progressive with applying good fire on the landscape as well. And where we can use that biomass to really support local communities. And I think we can really put local people, youth to work on the landscape for healthier, more resilient landscapes because of climate change, increasing fire seasons, and expanding population base. So I think there's really good opportunities for a lot of, if there's the political will and there's the social will to do this. Not only the will, but the demand really has to come from the people, the constituents of all the states to say, we want to see this partnership between the Forest Service and the federal government and our state governments to actually work on our behalf so that we have healthy landscapes for our kids and our grandkids.
Mm-hmm. And Jonathan, what about you? What do you wish the congressional delegation would better understand about what you all need and what's at risk if these changes aren't implemented?
Right. So I guess I would hope that it's impressed upon them that this isn't a regional or any one state issue. This is a national issue. You're feeling the impacts from smoke from these wildfires all the way, in the nation's capital, and it's degrading air quality, and it's subjecting sensitive populations to more risk from the degraded air quality. The other thing that comes to mind is that if we lose our capacity to manage our lands, we also lose our capacity to do other things like protect critical watersheds that countless cities, towns, municipalities depend on. We lose the ability to harvest timber, to build infrastructure, to rebuild towns and cities, and so really it's becoming just a large issue that doesn't belong to any one state. It's not a California issue. It's not a New Mexico issue. I mean, it's really a whole national issue. And I guess what I'd like to see is Congress, appropriate and authorize more funding to the land management agencies to expand the workforce needed to attain these land management targets that they set. Maybe think outside of the box like Kelly and Marcus were talking about, and offer like land management scholarships or tuition assistance for college students who study in certain fields and want to develop or devote some of their time rather to land management issues. So I think that there are creative ways that we could expand our workforce and really focus on these issues. And I just hope that Congress is paying attention to the land management agencies and also their constituents and the states that are impacted by all of this.
So we're talking about like trying to envision something different, thinking outside the box. There are other places that do things differently, and you were in Australia for that really awful fire season in 2019 and learned some lessons there. I'm curious what you learned about wildland firefighting in Australia that could be implemented here in the US maybe.
I think some of the things that I was kind of really taken aback with, we have sort of similar systems that intermingle easily with the way we structure our incident management teams and our fires. But I think they had, the state of Victoria in particular, because they don't have a federal system like us, so it's by state, so we'll make that clear. And they have a large volunteer service as well that works on a lot of their wildland fire. But for the state employees in particular, they really recognized they needed more flexibility. A known issue in our wildland firefighters is really the lack of diversity and the lack of representation by, say, women, people of color, you name it. And part of that is really that workforce flexibility. So I saw in Australia, here a standard tour is 14, can be up to 21, used to be longer. And with travel days, you could be away from home for 21, 30 days even potentially. There, I saw a mother with kids who was an incident commander, a rather high-ranking incident commander, would come for 5 days and said, I have to take care of my kids on the weekends, would drive back to her house, would be there 3 or 4 days and come back for 4 or 5 days. And it was really a kind of eye-opening picture for me. And you would talk to our firefighters about, oh, that will never work, this or that. And it's really those kind of things where I think we need to really think, how are we treating firefighters? Why do we not have many women like Kelly who advanced all the way? A lot of women want families, and it's very difficult for men or women to have families. You saw that's why John got out. And so we need to think about how are we going to take care of that employee as a whole and not just kind of use them as temporary fodder that we feed to the system and then kick them out. But how are we taking care of that employee as a whole? And I think Australia is really on to some of those things. They pay some increased stipend and on-call benefits, which we don't pay in the United States. So all of our federal firefighters, pretty much you're on call unless you're on rest and relaxation for a couple of days after a tour. And that means you're on unpaid call. Your travel is restricted. You can't necessarily go and do certain things. You have to be within a certain amount from your fire base. And we don't compensate anybody for any of that, which Australia does, which I thought, well, that's a great idea. You're compensating people for that time. Compensating people for working in remote areas, because they were facing the same thing that we're starting to face, where they couldn't get folks, to live in their remote duty stations. And so they recognized, hey, we probably need to compensate those folks more so their families can have a decent life out in a remote rural area. And so there's novel ways out there if we kind of can open our eyes and really think about those things. Yeah.
Well, thank you, all three of you, so much for this conversation. I have learned so much, and I really appreciate your time and your energy on this topic.
Thank you so much for having us, Laura. I think this is an issue. It's important to New Mexico. It's important to the United States, and I appreciate your time and interest.
Thanks.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.